My name is Glenn Rhees, and I was on the Bob Wills Band from November of 1957 until February the 6th of 1961. In that time, I worked for Bob full-time then, and a lot of our jobs were at the Golden Nugget in Las Vegas and different places like that. Some nights we'd work a real classy place. Some nights we'd work a dive, you might say, because Bob, he never frowned on anything where he'd play. He'd play real nice places and, like I say, a dive the next night. But them was his kind of people, he'd always say. He'd say, we're back with our kind of people. So that's what I'd done in the 4 years that I was with Bob, and I got a real comical story to tell. This was between me and Bob. We were playing Hobbs, New Mexico, and I met a fellow that night, and I was drinking pretty heavy back then, and we was playing the Maurice Club in Hobbs, New Mexico, which was owned by Snuffy Smith. And this particular night, why, I got out there with this fella, and we was drinking, and we got pretty loose and everything. And at the end of the job, why, his name was Joe Daniels, which was my wife's maiden name, and her dad was named Joe Daniels. And he had an airplane out at the airport, and he said, why don't I take all of you out and fly my airplane? So we all went out to the airport. It was Gene Crownover, Leon Rauch, myself, and Wade Peeler, and Jack Lloyd. So before we take off, why, he said, I have to change the oil in this airplane. And I says, my gosh, I've never changed the oil, but I'll help you. And here I am up and underneath that motor, and getting the oil plug out, and we drained the plane and everything, and got it full of oil. And he said, well, we're ready to take off. Well, I think the fellow was more inebriated than I was, really. I wondered, I thought, my gosh, am I going to be able to fly with this guy? And Crownover, he refused to fly. He came over and he says, Blub, don't get in that plane. And I says, well, I'm going to fly the plane. And so I gets in the plane and everything, and all of us, all but Crownover, and he started walking toward Hobbs. And so we took off, and boy, this guy was, even though he was soused to the gills, he could fly that plane. And we took off, and he'd go up in a stall. You know what a stall is. And he'd get up there until that thing would start toot-tooting, And whenever he hit a toot-toot, well, Jack Lloyd would holler, get it out of the stall, Joe. And here we go, boom, and go into a dive. And I got the wild idea. I said, let's buzz Gene, because he was on the highway walking back to town. So here we go toward Gene, and man, we just barely touch his head. I'm not kidding you. It had just come down in that dive and take off again. And Gene would jump in the ditch. Now that's how close we came to his head, hitting him. And he'd just dive in the ditch. Well, here we were, and boy, we'd take another big drink out of our bottle, and let's go again, Joe. Well, every once in a while, I said, let's buzz the motel where we're staying. So we kept buzzing the motel too, and then we'd fly back out by the airport, and we'd buzz old Gene, make him jump in the ditch and all that. Well, we flew until daylight, and finally went in for the landing, and we got back to the motel, and I think we was leaving to go to Lubbock or maybe El Paso after that, and we was all getting on the bus and everything, and somebody just mentioned to Bob. He says, Bob, how'd you sleep last night? And Bob said, well, I slept pretty good, but did y'all hear that airplane that kept buzzing the motel? And incidentally, I was helping Joe fly the airplane, see? And everybody started laughing. Well, whenever I got in the bus, I went way back in the back, because I just knew somebody was going to mention it to Bob, that was me. And so everybody started laughing. They said, Bob, you know who that was? It was buzzing the motel. And he said, no, who was it? And he says, it's Blub. And he hollered back, he says, my God, Glenn, was that you? Yeah, and I said, yeah, and I was helping him fly it too. And he says, well, what if you had crashed? And I said, well, Bob, you could have sent me a rose.